Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eaterberg, and today I'll be discussing the 1929 film The Letter with my friend Louis Beer, who writes the Slow Moving Pictures newsletter and helped me kick off this season of the Oscars in my second Academy Awards preview. Louis, welcome back to the show.
Hello, Jonathan. Thank you very much for having me back.
So before we get into today's film, remind listeners who you are and where they can find your work online.
Yes, so as you said, I write a blog called Slow Moving Pictures, which you can find on Substack. And every week in 2025, every Saturday, I am publishing an essay about Red Desert, the Antonioni film from 1964, sort of going through the film minute by minute, trying to say everything I can possibly think of to say about it in 52 parts. So yeah, do give it a look if you're at all interested in Red Desert or Antonioni generally.
Well, before we get into The Letter, I do want to update our place in history. So our last film was released on April 5th, I think it was, if I'm looking at my notes correctly. So in the intervening about week and a half or so between that film and this film's release, on April 7th, 1929, I copied this one straight from Wikipedia. I just loved it, and I wanted to read the whole thing. So what Wikipedia says on April 7th, 1929, Austro-Italian relations deteriorated over a football match after Austria defeated Italy 3-0 in the Central European International Cup play. Italians complained that a sideways Hungarian flag was used to represent Italy and that the Austrian band played the wrong Italian song. Italian newspapers also accused the Austrians of unfair play and called for a refusal to float the country any new loans. So I
Yeah.
love that little piece of history, crossing politics with football. There's so much in that short little paragraph.
Yeah, nothing changes, does it? People taking sport
Yeah.
waiting seriously and flags. Yeah.
Exactly. And then April 10th, we had an important or a notable actor being born, Swedish-American actor Max von Sydow,
Oh,
who's
yeah.
obviously known for films like Seventh Seal, Exorcist, Greatest Story Ever Told, and even appeared recently, fairly recently, on Game of Thrones just a few years ago. So he was born April 10th. And then on April 11th, there was a four-man crew of a plane called the Southern Cross, which had gone missing in Northwest Australia about 12 days prior. The crew was finally found on April 11th. So they survived whatever happened there. I had never really heard of that, but thought that was an interesting little tidbit. Any history facts that you found around this time?
I saw Max von Sydow was born as well. I'm a big fan of his. So that was around this week. Stalin was watching an initial version of Eisenstein's new film, The General Line, and giving him, no doubt, very unhelpful directions about how it should be changed. So that's interesting. And I did find an archived article from the Manchester Guardian on the 6th of April talking about a subject which I guess is relevant to today. It was about the coming of sound cinema and the end of the silent era. It says, the declaration of Fox, who own many kinemas, that's with a K, that's how it was sometimes spelt back then, that they will make no more silent films, has created a sensation. Hardly a day passed last week that did not bring its announcement on the question of sound. British films startled our ears with the grandness of their plans, it being known that Mr. Hitchcock's new film is to be talking, and that not to be outdone, Anthony Asquith will employ synchronization for his Cottage on Dartmoor. So I thought it was interesting to just quote that it was all in the news, sort of talking about how sound films were taking over. And later the article says, a bad film will not be any less bad or old-fashioned because it can be appalling noisily as well as visually. So it was kind of warning that we shouldn't get too caught up in this craze for sound cinema, that these new talkies could be just as bad as the silent films were.
Absolutely, and if anyone has been listening along to the films this season, there's been a couple of clunkers, both
Yeah.
on the sound side and on the silent side. So I think that's a very appropriate sentiment that's in that article. I like that. Well, let's move on to the film itself. So The Letter initially premiered in New York on March 17th, 1929, and then opened worldwide or countrywide, I'm not sure, April 13th, 1929. So we're using that date as our kind of official date. It was directed by Jean de Lemure. I'm probably butchering that French pronunciation.
Sounds right.
And it was from a screenplay by Garrett Fort and was based on the 1927 play of the same name by W. Somerset Maugham.
It stars Jeanne Eagles, again, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Leslie Crosby, Reginald Owen as Robert Crosby, Herbert Marshall as Jeffrey Hammond, O.P. Heggie as Mr. Joyce, and Lady Tsen Mei as Li Ti. It has a running time of just 60 minutes and was produced and distributed by Paramount Pictures.
Ed Eagles was the only Oscar nominee from the film. She was posthumously nominated for Best Actress at the Second Academy Awards. And as of this recording, there are several versions of the film on YouTube, as well as a fairly readily available DVD release of the film. So we'll get into the story. So the story is set in, I think it was Singapore, if I remember
Mhm.
correctly, on a rubber plantation owned by Robert Crosby and his wife, Leslie. And we open with a couple scenes of kind of the town and nearby area, and then before settling in on the home where these two live on this plantation. Two of them are hanging out in the evening, just doing their thing, and Robert Crosby ends up leaving to, I think it was go take one of his guns to have someone take a look at it. The reason's really not important. He leaves. Leslie quickly writes a letter and has it delivered by one of the local boys to Mr. Jeffrey Hammond, who you mentioned earlier. And basically, what we get is that Hammond comes over, reads the letter, comes over, and has a little bit of a argument with Leslie about their extramarital affair that they've got going on. And we also see at the end of that Leslie threatens to, well, she confronts him about this Chinese woman that is living in his house. And initially, he kind of denies it. Eventually, he does kind of admit it and says that the Chinese woman is his mistress and that he would choose the Chinese woman over Leslie if forced to pick. At which point, Leslie grabs a gun, shoots him initially once and then multiple times, killing him, which is kind of what kicks off this whole story that we're going to have throughout the rest of the film.
Great, two great moments, I think, when the camera goes through the trees and finds the
Yes.
bungalow in the rubber plantation. That was a really nice, obviously, a model part of it, but really nice tracking shot there. And then when she shoots Jeff Hammond, I love the look on her face, that look of total fury, and she comes really quite close to the camera. It's a great piece of acting there from Jeanne Eagles.
Yeah, and I really noticed the sound effect of the gun there.
Yeah.
Obviously it's an early sound film. I wasn't able to find anything of whether or not that sound was recorded on set or if it was done after the fact. I would imagine it was probably done on set, but I don't know that for sure. But it was very, very distinct, those multiple gunshots that she fires off in killing Hammond.
It was done on set, in fact, so I did find a detail about this. I
Okay.
mean, it was, they hadn't really mastered dubbing technology at this time. I think that took a few more years, but they had a problem with the sound of the gun. It was too loud. It kept blowing out the microphone, so they had to put less powder in it and make it a softer sound effect. But I agree, it's a very, that shows the importance of having the sound effect in there, and it's very impactful alongside Jeanne Eagles's furious face there.
Yeah, I think it definitely would have had a different effect had we not had sound in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we see that Hammond is dead, and then we immediately cut to Leslie in court being sworn in to be a witness at the trial, which we assume and are eventually we realize that it is her own murder trial. She's being interviewed by Mr. Joyce, who's the lawyer for the family, and telling her side of the story. And suddenly, the story that she's telling in court is very different from the story that we just saw in the first 5 to 10 minutes of the film. She tells it as more of a Hammond happens to stop by and he was drunk and ended up trying to essentially, sexually assault her. And then, she killed him in self defense is basically the story that she tells in court.
Yeah, I like the transition there from the close-up of the gun that Leslie has just fired to a sort of matching close-up of her hand on the Bible as she's swearing in court, and then we see that from a low angle as well with the kind of the hand and the Bible in focus and Leslie out of focus behind them. So it's kind of like the violent truth is replaced with this civilized lie. I think that's a big theme in this film. And she's swearing on the Bible, but you sort of see her out of focus for a second, like she's kind of dissociated from her act of swearing on the Bible. The real Leslie is sort of becoming hazy and indistinct as she tells this lie. I guess it's worth mentioning at that point that it's an interesting film about a false rape accusation. It kind of feeds into this
Yeah.
unfortunately quite popular kind of rape myth, about the prevalence of false accusations when the reality is that, most rapes kind of go unacknowledged and unreported and uninvestigated. But it's a really interesting illustration of maybe one of the reasons why that's such a popular myth, because it makes for a better story, I guess. There's something very, compelling about, Somerset Maugham heard this story of a woman who had killed someone and was ultimately acquitted. And I think he sort of thought to himself, "Well, I bet it was a crime of passion." And, she's told a sort of full story about that because that reflects his views on women. Probably he was kind of misogynistic in some ways, but also his eye for a good story, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting and might be a good point to bring up here as well that the structure of the film is quite different from the play that the film is based on. In the play, it similarly begins with the murder, but it is really just the moment of the actual murder with the gun going. I think in the script that I saw, it's basically the curtain rises and you hear a gunshot and Hammond has just been shot. So we miss all of the lead up into that. We know he's been killed, but we don't know any of that backstory as to what was going on. And then the rest of the film from or the rest of the play from there is her initially telling her story to the lawyer, and we don't get any courtroom scenes if I remember in the play from reading it,
That's right.
but we do get kind of the reactions of things that are going on just after the courtroom scenes and just before and things like that. And then we don't get the actual truth until the very end of the play. And actually, there's two different versions where in one version, she basically tells the truth finally at the end. In the other version, it kind of goes into a flashback and we get to see that the scene that begins the movie, we get to see that on the stage at the end of the play instead.
Yeah. It's a very strange decision, isn't it? Because I don't know if you had a chance to see the Betty Davis film. I've never seen the play performed on stage, but when you see it for the first time, it's just this shot of the house, and you mentioned that the sound effect of the gun earlier being so powerful. Well, that's how the play is supposed to begin. It's just with the gunshot, and then Hammond staggers out onto the veranda, and then she just shoots him and shoots him, and you don't know who the people are or any of the context. It's such an unforgettable opening, and it's very strange to leave that until you're about 15 minutes into this film. That's when that happens. I wonder if they're trying to make it easier for the audience. Maybe sometimes they felt that cinema audiences were stupider than theater audiences and couldn't follow an ambiguous, complex plot. But I also wonder if it's the restrictions of sound technology, because I think the way it works in the play, for this to work, you really need several characters on stage kind of, and you need them to be able to move around and have dialogue with each other as Leslie tells her story initially. And I think maybe that was quite difficult for them to do it at this time. Most of the scenes in this film are just two shots with just two characters talking to each other. So yeah, a number of reasons why they may have chosen to restructure it.
Yeah, and I haven't had a chance to see the 1940 version with Betty Davis. Does that follow the similar structure to this film, or is it closer to the play?
It's much closer to the play. I'd say it improves on the play in a number of ways. I think it leaves out some of the clunky dialogue. The big difference, I guess we can get to at the end, but it's because it was made during the production code, the enforcement of the production code. Leslie can't get away with murder, so she
Right.
has to be killed off at the end. Really, in every other way, I think it's sort of a perfect adaptation of the play. But the more I watched this one, actually, the more interesting I got. I found it, and I do think it's strange decisions in adapting the play are kind of interesting in themselves. The fact that we know what Leslie did from the beginning, and then we see the trial. It's kind of like a Columbo episode, or that film Player. There is something interesting about telling the audience everything from the beginning.
Yeah, definitely. I did actually like that aspect of it, and
Hmm.
I do wanna see the 1940 version and so that I can compare the 2, but in a way, I do like that we know everything. We and Leslie know everything, and everyone else is trying to figure out the actual truth.
I think it's kind of good that you haven't seen the 1940 version, because a lot of people see that first, and then you can't help comparing the two. And I think it was helpful for me to rewatch this and think and try and forget that version, because I think this one has points of interest of its own.
So back to our plot, she's telling her story being questioned by the defense lawyer, Mr. Joyce. We get a short cross examination. It's really one or two questions, I think, before court is adjourned for the following day. And then Joyce sends his assistant, who is a Singaporean attorney, away for the day. And as the assistant leaves, we see him stop, but he's stopped by two women in the hallway of the courthouse. One of whom was Hammond's mistress, T. Lee.
Yeah, Liti, I think. Yeah.
Liti, yeah, Liti, sorry. And they kind of converse quietly. We don't really know what they say. There's no subtitles, there's no dialogue that we can hear. So we don't know what's going on, but they're saying something to him. And eventually we find out that as the assistant comes back to Joyce's office a little bit later, that the Liti has the possession of the letter. Obviously, the title of the film and the play is all about this letter. And that's the letter that Leslie wrote to Hammond to ask him to come over the night of the murder. So she's got some very damning evidence in her hands. And we find out that she wants $10,000 for the letter in order for it to not to fall into the hands of the prosecution and be used as evidence against Leslie in court. So we also get a couple of scenes in the jail. Initially, before that scene with about the letter, before we find out all about that, there's a short scene with Robert Crosby and Leslie in the jail, and they're kind of discussing the end of the trial the following days. She continuing to say, "Oh, I love you. You're the only one for me." Yada yada yada, which of course we know is a complete lie at this point. And he suggests that they leave. They go to London, or no, she suggests that they leave and go to London. He's kind of telling her that he's already planning a trip. He's going to buy a new rubber plantation in Sumatra so they can get away from everything. And then eventually we find out that the $10,000 that's going to be used to buy this letter is basically all the money that Mr. Crosby has been saving up to try and buy this other plantation. So it's going to put all of those plans completely, unattainable at that point.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So there's a moment here where he says he's hoping to buy this rubber plantation in Sumatra, and Jeanne Eagles gives this reaction which looks kind of troubled. She looks disturbed by that. Now, in the play and in the other versions of this, she's troubled because by that point she knows that he's going to lose all that money, and so he can't buy the rubber plantation in Sumatra, and she realizes this is kind of what this is the precipitating factor in kind of forcing him to see the letter because he has to know what's happened. But in this version, it's a little different because that hasn't happened yet, and I think it's sort of setting up something at the end which isn't really in the play, which is her kind of frustration over rubber. She's at the end of the play, she's going to reveal her feelings about rubber and how sick she is of hearing about it. And I think her reaction here maybe conveys that. It's like, oh God, another rubber plantation just in a
Right.
different place. So I quite liked that little touch there and how it's a slightly different meaning perhaps from in the play.
Yeah, she just wants to go back home to England and never
Yes.
never hear the word rubber again.
Yeah.
Back to the letter itself, Joyce confronts Leslie about the letter, and initially she kind of stands by her testimony in court, but eventually she does admit that the letter is probably genuine, and kind of asks Joyce to basically do whatever he can to obtain the letter, not for her sake, but for Robert's sake, so that he can kind of not be aware of what's been going on. And the two requirements are obviously the $10,000 in cash for the letter, because they don't want any promissory notes or anything like that. They want cold hard cash. And Lee T has said that Leslie has to be the one to deliver the money herself. So it's not really explained how they're going to manage to get her out of jail to go give this money to Liti, but they gloss over that and make it happen. And that's the chance that Liti has to kind of confront her, since she was the one that killed not only her lover, but also Liti's lover at that point. So, and that was a really interesting scene for me with the two of them,
Yeah.
where they're making that exchange. Initially, she kind of goes to hand the money, and he's pushing her aside. It appears that there's, I don't know if they were supposed to be prostitutes in a cage in the room. It
Yeah.
was a very very odd scene in general.
Yeah. Very odd. And this whole scene, I agree, it's really interesting. And this is something that I think that this film adds to the story, the idea that Leslie has to go and pick up the letter herself. In the original short story, it was the husband goes with the lawyer because he's found out about the letter at that point. In the play, it's just the lawyer, and now it's just Leslie. It's interesting that you say, as you say, it doesn't make sense that they can get her out of jail like that, and that is something that the 1940 version kind of picks up on and explains. But they obviously thought this was a good idea to have Leslie being the one going and collecting the letter. And yeah, it's a very strange scene. And this scene where she confronts Li Ti is, I think, unique to this version. It's not like this in the 1940 version, and there's nothing like this in the play or the story. So this really is a kind of an edition made for specifically for this film.
Yeah, so eventually, Liti does end up taking the money. Leslie gets the letter and leaves, and then basically the final, penultimate scene essentially is back in court the next day. They read a not guilty verdict, which is followed by some awesome reaction shots. Some of my favorite shots in the whole film were the
Mm.
reactions of the various people. We get Liti, who's in court, who's obviously frustrated with it. Joyce, the assistant, are obviously they know what's in the letter, and then Mr. Crosby's kind of the happiest out of everybody because his wife has been acquitted of murder. So, but I really like some of those reaction shots when they first read the verdict.
It's great. Yeah, there's so much, there's so many sort of complex emotions in those reaction shots, and I think that that
Yeah,
was probably another big influence on the 1940 version because they really make a lot out of that moment after the not guilty verdict and how everyone reacts, how they interact with each other. It's a really rich moment of kind of cinematic drama there.
yeah. So then in our final scene, we're back at the Crosby's home. We see Mr. Crosby and Mr. Joyce, the lawyer, discussing kind of what the charges are going to be for for being the defense attorney at the trial. And Joyce basically tells him, there's no cost for actually defending her, but there's some other costs that we had to incur that are that you'll have to pay to take care of. And when Robert starts to press him about it, he eventually shows him the letter, and he reads the letter, realizes what Leslie has done, and then Mr. Joyce and Mrs. Joyce's wife, leave a few moments later, and that's when finally Leslie and Robert have a discussion, I guess we'll put it, about the
Mm.
letter. And she finally admits to Robert that she was having an affair with Hammond, and that she killed him, just as we saw it at the very beginning of the film. Initially, she thinks that Crosby's going to send her away or something, but basically he says, "Nope, you're going to stay here with me." And the end of the film is her proclaiming that she still loves the man that she killed. She's never going to give up on that.
Yeah, this is the best bit of the film, for me. I mean, this was the highlight. I just, it's such an electrifying confrontation between them, and all down to Jeanne Eagles. Really, I don't think Reginald Ovid is great in this scene, but I mean, this would be the clip that you would show from the film. I think to kind of make the case for people today about why it's important. And the way she acts here. I mean, I found a few contemporary reviews that kind of describe this as a new style of acting. That this is like a really groundbreaking moment in sound cinema. That there's something really kind of new about what Jeanne Eagles is doing. And watching her, I was thinking, I found a quote from her talking about how she would kind of improvise when she was on stage, and she was frustrated at not being able to do that as much in the cinema. But there's a really kind of improvisational feel to some of it. Like she sort of talks at the same time as Reginald Owen. Sometimes she's sort of muttering under her breath while he's still talking. Made me think of Jenna Rollins in A Woman Under the Influence, the John Cassavetes film, or like Jean Arthur in Howard Hawks films or something. I think Howard Hawks would have worked really well with Jeanne Eagles if she'd lived long enough to be in any of his films, because she's got that kind of talking at the same time as other characters. And there was a moment here that I just wanted to pick out where she's complaining about the rubber, and she says, "I had to listen to you talk of rubber," and her English accent, which she's been sort of scrupulously keeping up for the whole film, breaks down slightly, and you hear a little bit of her American act, like, "I had to listen to you." And there's this kind of fury and frustration in that voice, and a sort of respectability, I guess, is breaking down, and she's really just expressing how she feels. And I was 100% on her side in this moment. I don't care what she's done. I just think
Yeah.
what a boring husband she has and a boring life, and you just feel like, yeah, you tell him, tell him that you still love the man you killed, and feels like a moment of triumph for her, even though she's ostensibly, being punished. It's great. I just love it.
Yeah. Yeah, I there was one, not a contemporary review, but, it was Andre Soares on a website called Alt Film Guide, wrote a really nice, little tidbit that I wanted to flag about her. It says, "Jeanne Eagles is its very dramatic core, its beginning and its end. Everything revolves around her."
Yeah.
And I think that, it's she's the central character in the film, so she's gotta kind of run things, but, everything that scene with Robert at the end, the scene with Leety, when they're exchanging the letter, the courtroom scene, that all focuses in on her, and it doesn't work if she's not delivering 110%.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just quote one other review, which I think speaks to that as well. That and because I think people today might watch Jeanne Eagles in this film and think it's quite a strange performance. It's unusual. It's very eccentric and sort of erratic in some ways. But what reviewer at the time said, oh, actually, I think this was a director who'd worked with her and was and worked on some of her films. But he said many good actors imagine they have done all their duty when they speak their lines perfectly, with studious diction and careful emphasis. It is like putting a record on a phonograph. But Jeannie knows the thoughts and feeling of the character which make her give utterance to those words. She brings that understanding into her expression, and you get the full significance. The lines hit you the way she speaks them; they are alive. And I thought that was a really great description of the kind of acting she does here, where it is disturbing. It's genuinely kind of uncomfortable to watch
Yeah.
because it feels real. It feels like you're watching a real person kind of feel these things. And I think, yeah, that kind of again, that's that kind of improvisational feel to to her performance. It seems very spontaneous and very natural somehow.
Yeah. Well, we'll continue on. Since we're already talking about Jeanne Eagles, I'll kind of jump into just anything, some of the background on her. Obviously, mentioned at the top that she passed away soon after this film came out and before the second Academy Awards. Was a Broadway actress. Again, like you said, she did a lot of work on Broadway, including a extensive stint as Sadie Thompson in a 1922 production of Rain, which was based on a Malm short story as well. So interesting connection there. She had a couple silent films in the 1910s, and then returned for three films in 1927 through 29. This being one of them. And then she, October 3rd, 1929, passed away, likely due to a drug overdose of some sort. Some various reports, whether it was more alcohol related or more drug related, but generally it's pretty well established, I think, that it was some sort of drug or alcohol that caused her ultimate demise.
Yeah.
Which is a shame because I mean, I would have loved to have seen more of her, and I have a feeling had we had her for another even 10 or 15 years, she would have been popping up at the Oscars fairly regularly with some of the bigger names that we know today.
It feels like that, doesn't it? It really feels like we were robbed of a really remarkable actor who would have, alongside Betty Davis and Joan Crawford and Barbara Stanwyck. She's in that kind of class, I think. She's mentioned in All About Eve. The George Sanders mentions her, I think, in that film. She apparently was the inspiration for Betty Davis's performances in the 30s in Of Human Bondage and Dangerous. Barbara Stanwyck was a big fan, and apparently she was. I think you mentioned Babylon on an episode a while ago. The Margot Robbie character in Babylon was partly inspired by Jeanne Eagles. I was thinking about this watching. This is my dedication to the podcast. Jonathan and I watched a film called Jeanne Eagles, made in 1957.
I've read about that one too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not good. It's not really worth watching, but it's kind of interesting. But it's apparently completely inaccurate. I mean, the Jeanne Eagles family sued the makers of the film because it was kind of slanderous. But, it's interesting because it has a scene that's a lot like the one in Babylon where Margot Robbie confronts the high class, pretentious people at that party, and sort of yells at them for sort of looking down their nose at her, and, you see Jeanne Eagles do that in that film. I don't know how true that was of her, but I think that was sort of part of her story. She had a troubled background, came from the didn't perhaps have the kind of high class pedigree that theatre and film actors were expected to have at this time, but obviously a really distinctive, the troubled actor.
Yeah. And then Reginald Owen, who played Robert Crosby, the husband, British actor, appeared in some silent films, and then it appeared that he was a lot more successful in sound films later on. Folks listening to the podcast might recognize him most as Admiral Boom from Mary Poppins, or
Yep.
Major General Sir Brian Tiegler in Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which were a couple of his the last roles of his career when he was much older. And the one little bit of trivia I did find on him, in 1964, the Beatles were performing at the Hollywood Bowl and couldn't find any hotels that would let them rent rooms. So Mr. Owen rented his Bel Air mansion to the Beatles while they were there.
Oh, that's great.
Thought that was a nice little piece of trivia.
Yeah, I know him from a William Wyler film made a few years after this called The Good Fairy, which is well worth seeing. It's a really funny screwball comedy, and also features Herbert Marshall, who we're just about to talk about, I think.
Yeah, so we'll move on to Herbert Marshall. His was the most interesting story out of everybody in this
Yeah.
film that I was digging into. Served in the British Army in World War One, shot in the knee, ultimately causing the amputation of his left leg, which didn't seem to slow him down in terms
No.
of being productive in Hollywood. A couple years later, he would appear in Hitchcock's film Murder, and played again opposite many of the leading ladies of the day. Some many of which you already mentioned: Marlene Dietrich, Greta Garbo, Stanwyck, Joan Crawford, Betty Davis. He worked with all of those big names. And then the other little bit I had on him was because of his own amputation, he spent a lot of time traveling to army hospitals during and after the Second World War, and especially focusing on amputee victims like himself. And initially, kind of wanted to do it under the radar and not really make a big fuss out of it, but eventually had some news articles written about it, and even some nice praise that I read from none other than General Dwight Eisenhower himself.
Yeah, I'm a fan of Herbert Marshall. I really like him, and he played Robert Crosby, the husband, in the 1940 version of The Letter. So it's really strange to kind of see him playing the lover in this one.
Yeah,
With Betty Davis, and then he was unhappily married to Betty Davis again in William Wyler's next film, The Little Foxes. So there's a real kind of tangle of William Wyler connections here because
yeah.
he also directed The Good Fairy, and these are all great films that I've just mentioned. So yeah, Herbert Marshall always worth watching in these films.
And then Mr. and Mrs. Joyce. Obviously, Mr. Joyce is the lawyer. He's a little bit of a bigger presence in this film. This is his wife's really only in that last scene back at the house before the final confrontation. O.P. Heggie was an Australian actor, plays Mr. Joyce, and he was best known for portraying the hermit who befriends the monster in The Bride of Frankenstein in 1935. And I guess he was noticed initially by Norma Shearer and her husband, Irving Thalberg. I think it was in Australia, and they convinced him to come over to Hollywood and try his hand there. And then Irene Brown, who plays his wife, not too much on her. She had a few silent film credits, and then she also appeared. We'll talk about her briefly again in a little couple of years with the Best Picture winning film Cavalcade. But I don't think she's really anywhere Oscar adjacent beyond that. So not too much on her.
I noticed she's in Pygmalion and The Red Shoes. Those were the sort of two most famous films I could see in her filmography that I know her from. But I have to say I can't remember her very well from those films.
And then Lady Tian Mei as Li Ti. She was very interesting. And I wondered, didn't do any of the research until after I'd seen the film. And as I was watching, it felt to me like it almost felt like she was a Caucasian white actor who they had made up to play an Asian character. And in doing some digging afterwards, I find out that she is Chinese father, American mother. So she is
Yeah.
of mixed race ancestry. So it kind of made a little bit of sense there when I found that out, that she wasn't fully Chinese descent or Asian descent.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? She's having to sort of play a bit of a caricatured role here. I mean, it's a dated performance in some ways, but it's very again, it's kind of fits into the eccentric mode of this film, and I think she's quite a nice foil for Jeanne Eagles in that sense. She really plays it over the top in that scene, and it's that's quite fun. Yeah, so, a scholar called Dr. Ramona Curry has apparently done quite a bit of work on Lady Tsen May. I found an article about that. So if people want to look up Ramona Curry and her work on Lady Tsen May, I think there's some interesting information out there.
Yeah, and she was in a film, 1918 film called For the Freedom of the East, and they billed her as, quote, "the screen's only Chinese star." And around the same time, also, there's a full page article about her in Photoplay magazine, which I'll link to in the show notes. I thought that was kind of interesting. Obviously, I think general audiences would have had an easier time reading about somebody like that who is part Caucasian, part Asian, rather than someone who is full Asian. But
Yeah.
that's just the nature of the times, I suppose, which is unfortunate. And then the last person I want to mention, Tamaki Yoshiwara as Ong Chi Sang, the lawyer assistant who finds out about the letter initially. I really came up with no information about him other than that this appears to be the only film he was ever in. So
Yeah.
I wasn't able to find any other credits for him on Wikipedia, IMDb. Nothing had anything else other than this film. So Tamaki, wherever you are, hope you had a good rest of your life after you made this film.
Yeah, he's I mean, I couldn't help thinking about the actor who plays this role in the 1940 version, Victor Sen Yung, who is brilliant. I mean, it still has kind of racist overtones there, but it's a little less racist than the play, actually. Somerset Maugham really seems to have thought it was quite funny that this character can't pronounce the letter R, and there's some other stuff like that in the play, but in the 1940 film, Victor Sen Yung gives a really subtle sort of layered performance as Ong Chi Seng, which kind of rises above the material a little bit. Tamaki Yoshiwara, I thought, was just playing it as a caricature. Unfortunately, I'm sure that's why he was directed to do, but still.
Yeah, yeah. So then the story, you kind of mentioned it earlier on that the story was based on an actual case in Kuala Lumpur. In that case, the woman was acquitted in 1911 of the crime. And there's more that people can find out about that. I don't think it's really too relevant here, other than that it was the basis for the story when Mom started writing it. The film itself, information I found about it was that it was filmed at Astoria Studios in Queens. So interesting that we've had a couple of films about. Well, this is the second film about that area of the world, Pacific, South Pacific, Asia, whatever the whole Pacific area of the world this season on the podcast. First one being White Shadows in the South Seas, which was filmed all in the South Pacific in Tahiti. This one, obviously, they're doing it much closer to home, probably on a much lower budget than traveling halfway around the world to film in Singapore. And then a couple of just trivia pieces I had. So the $10,000 for the acquiring the letter, I did a quick search online, and in today's money, that turns out to be about $187,000, which is quite a sum of money to pay for one piece of paper that could save someone's life or doom them in another way.
Yeah, it's always hard to know how much these amounts represent, isn't it, in old film?
Yeah.
Kind of
Yeah.
never.
And I also just in terms of talking about money, I also I've looked it up, but I didn't write it down. So the one scene that I didn't mention as we were doing our plot summary, when Leslie goes to acquire the letter and pay the $10,000, this drinking establishment, party establishment of some sort that they're in, there's a bunch of I think there's sailors at the bar, and there's a guy he's got a turban, so he's, some sort of Arab descent or something, and he's got a cobra that he can fight with a mongoose, and the sailors are trying to get him to set up this fight between the cobra and the mongoose, which we get to see in the film, which was, again, kind of out of place, very odd.
Yes.
But they were asking initially, he was asking $25 for that, and eventually accepts $20. I can't remember what the conversion was for that, but it was, a couple $100, I think, for this, what ends up being about 30 seconds or less of entertainment, quote unquote, for this cobra to fight the mongoose.
Yeah, life before the internet. I did find out an interesting detail about this. So there were a couple of reviews that noted this scene with the snake and the mongoose, and apparently it is from an UFA short film. So UFA was a German studio at this time, and the short film was called "Killing the Killer." One reviewer says that here the producer has spliced in sections from the UFA short subject, which has been shown all over the country. The crowd at the film's premiere identified it instantly, and the effect on the spectators was distinctly bad, introducing, as it did, a brutal jolt to the whole illusion. So apparently, this was like the equivalent of a kind of viral video, I guess,
Yeah.
that people were very familiar with. A lot of appetite for seeing animals kill each other, I guess, in the
Yeah.
1920s.
I almost feel like if they the thing that springs to mind initially is if they had spliced in a couple of shots of the Pixar tin toy, one of the original shorts that they made, spliced those into Toy Story or something like that.
Yes, yeah.
That's the best analogy I can make on the fly here.
Or just that video of Fenton chasing the deer, suddenly that appears in the film. It's because you can see in this one that it's not in an indoor we're in an indoor setting, an interior setting in this club. And then this cobra and the mongoose, they're uh,
They're out in the wild.
floating on some rocks. Yeah, they're out in the
Yeah.
wild. So it's yeah. I guess they put it in to kind of establish that this is a sort of dark, savage place where anything can happen. It's Leslie is watching this from a distance, I think, and so again, it has slightly racist overtones, I guess, that she's gone
Oh,
into
yeah.
this kind of lawless space where things like this happen, but it does feel out of place.
Yeah. You already mentioned, Marshall appeared in the 1940 remake. This version of the film was actually believed to have been lost for some time, but they found a print in 2011, which was restored, and eventually that's around the time that the DVD release was finally made of the film, so making it, much more available, which was great. I'm glad it's part of the record at this point.
Yeah, the Warner Archive collection, those DVDs are real hits, and there are lots of great things on that series.
Yep, absolutely. I know we mentioned a couple of the reviews and things earlier. Anything else you have, reviews wise or kind of general critique of the film?
One interesting comment was from the Variety review that I found, which said any summary of the picture must record that the merits of the screen production belong to the original play, written for and played on the stage, and the filming has contributed only atmospheric details. That is to say, the production is entirely a transcription of a stage work, and the cinema version does little to make the subject matter its own. And I don't think that's true. I mean, because as we've talked about, it does change some things about the play quite drastically. The William Wyler was so good at turning plays into films in a way that was sort of faithful to the play, but was also very cinematic. So I think he does a great job in the 1940 version. But this one is they've made more radical changes to it, I think, to adapt it to the specific context of an early sound film, and I think that makes it that's part of what makes it so interesting.
Yeah, we had skipped into talking about the actors earlier. We didn't really get to talk about Mount very much. Mentioned him before when I covered Sadie Thompson, which was also based on his play Rain, or his story, which then was turned into a play. It's all very convoluted.
Yeah.
But the one little tidbit I had about him in terms of his playwriting time was that at one point, 1908, he had 4 plays running simultaneously on the West End in London. So he was very prolific. I think anybody going to see this would have at least heard the name and know that name during that time period.
Yeah, he's a very prolific author, wasn't he? I mean, I have to say I haven't read much of his work. I've read about him. I know he was, at this time in the sort of 1910s and 20s, was very unhappily married and was gay. So I think he's writing a lot about those kind of what you see in the letter, I think, is a real exploration of this idea of, the veil of civilization and respectable society, in the sense that underneath that there are all these kind of boiling emotions and this, hidden savagery. It is kind of a misogynistic story in some ways, the story of a false rape accusation. And I think Leslie is portrayed in a slightly kind of demonized way. But I also think we're supposed to kind of empathize with her. I think in some ways she kind of represents this feeling of like, I have all these emotions and all these passions and I can't express them. And there's a tremendous catharsis at the end of the play when she finally gets to say how she feels. And yeah, it seems like that may have had some kind of autobiographical significance for Somerset Maugham. Not to oversimplify these things, but
Yeah.
that seems to be a theme in a lot of his work.
Yeah, and he definitely likes that exotic location for setting his plays because obviously Sadie Thompson is
Yeah.
South Pacific as well. So obviously, folks can go back to that and listen to that episode from a while back. At the Oscars, as mentioned at the top, the letter was only nominated for 1 award for Jeanne Eagles for Best Actress, which eventually went to Mary Pickford for Coquette, which I discussed last week. And as of today, in 2025 here, Eagles remains the only person to be posthumously nominated for Best Actress in that near 100-year history. There's been a few in other acting categories and other categories in general, but in that particular category, she's the only posthumous nomination for 97 years of Oscars so far. So anything else you want to touch on before we give some final thoughts and give out some ratings?
I think we've covered most of the things I was hoping to talk about. I mean, I think there are some other kind of nice visual moments in this film, like when she goes down into the club in Singapore. There's this really dark staircase that she comes down and then comes back up again. That's a very atmospheric shot, and the establishing shot of the inside of the club is really interesting as well. It's a really nicely decorated set, and there's a big wooden pillar in the center of the frame, which is kind of in focus, and then the rest is hazy, and there's a sort of dark wooden structure at the upper part of the frame. So it really gives you this feeling of being somewhere underground and yeah, somewhere subterranean, which again, as we said earlier, kind of feeds into the themes. But otherwise, I thought that a lot of the sets in this film were kind of dull, especially the visiting room in the jail. Apparently, a lot of work was put into the courtroom scene, and that was a big set, but that also seemed a little dull, I guess. Visually, I think it's not always the most interesting film. You're often stuck in this. The camera is too close to the actor, because the restrictions of where the microphone has to be. It can be a little difficult to watch, especially on a first viewing. But I would urge people, if they've only seen it once, to try it again, because I think it does get better with multiple views.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to go ahead and give this film a 7 out of 10. I think it's got some really great, like we've already mentioned, Eagles acting throughout really grounds the film. In some respects, the directing choice and the screenwriting choice to kind of change the order of things from the play does work in some respects, but also, I'd be interested to see kind of how this version of it would be different had it stuck closer to the timeline or the order of the play itself. The one thing I will say is I truly appreciate the fact that it's only an hour long. I think it works perfectly as the running time of just an hour in this particular version. I think if it had gone on much longer, it would have felt like it dragged out. So I really appreciated that they edited together nice and tight in that 1 hour time frame. So 7 out of 10 for me for The Letter.
I agree on all of that, really. I also was going to give it 7 out of 10, and I also love the fact that it's an hour long. I mean, even though I think I know I keep talking about the remake, the 1941, which I would give 10 out of 10. I think that's a perfect film. You could use it as a textbook on how to make a great film, especially based on a play. But yeah, 7 out of 10 for this. It definitely grew on me. I watched it 3 times in preparation for this podcast, and it just kept getting better. I think, I really recommend it to people to check it out, even though it's the more obscure version of this story. I think it has a lot of virtues of its own, and is a really strange and unique film, especially for Jeanne Eagles, but not just because of her. I think lots of things about the way it's made are worth talking about. There was just one other thing, actually. I mean, maybe this is slightly out of place to bring it up here, but there was an interesting detail about the writer Garrett Ford, who adapted this for the screen. I noticed looking him up that he worked on several of the Universal horror films in the 1930s, and that kind of clicked for me why this film was growing on me as I watched it, and why I came to like it more, because I think there are some things in the film that kind of feel like something from The Invisible Man or Bride of Frankenstein, or
Yeah.
that kind of strange, slightly perverse sense of humor that you get in those films. I think is one of the things that makes this film unique, especially in the confrontation with Lee T. That feels like something out of The Invisible Man, or, under Dr. Moreau or something. It's got that strange pre-code sense of humor to it, that slightly sadistic sense of humor, which is very weird and wonderful, and part of what makes this a special film, I think.
Yeah, I did see that as well, and I definitely I like that you had that connection there. I think it makes a lot of sense. Well, I will be sure to include a list of resources, links to the articles and reviews that we mentioned in the episode, as well as a link to where you can watch The Letter online for yourself. Lewis, thanks again for coming on the show to talk about this film, and remind people one more time where they can find your work.
Yeah, it's Slow Moving Pictures on Substack, or you can put the URL slowmovingpictures.org if you're interested in hearing everything I have to say about Red Desert.
And don't forget to follow The Oscar Project at theoscarproject.substack.com. And be sure to come back for next Friday's episode of the podcast, where I will be discussing the film Alibi. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at the movies.